I want to welcome all of you. Fortunately, we have a nice day. There's no trucks overturned. There's not. My children are here, and I'm so proud. Can you just raise your hand and say, "Hey"? My son flew in from Las Vegas, Nevada. My daughter came up from Denver. My theater critic friend Tony Tresca's over here, who came up from Denver and interviewed me for Onstage Colorado. So I want to thank all of you for showing up today, and our panel members, Amanda Giguere and Kevin Rich. They came up from the Front Range, from the Boulder area. Michelle Schupe is our actress tonight. Peter Garino. They've come in from the Chicago area. So this is no small accomplishment to get these people coming from so far away with the challenges that we face here. I want to thank a couple other people specifically, in addition to all the people who have donated, who have partnered, who've helped out. One of the Symposium volunteers went to get Michelle the other night at the airport when we were blocked by the semi and couldn't get down there to get her. So it's a team effort. But I particularly want to recognize Mary Pat Rapp. Just raise your hand. And why I say that is Mary Pat was the person she's in my class. I teach a class called Shakespeare for Fun, and she's one of my students. But she said, "What are you going to do with this graduate degree you're getting in Shakespeare?" And I said, "Well, I want to do this thing called Weekend with Will." And she said, "Well, maybe I could get the Symposium involved." So thank you, Mary Pat, I owe you. And another person I want to recognize, he's not going to want me to, is John Wilcox, who is another student in my class. And he's the person who, all along the way, whenever I had any kind of self-doubt, said, "You've got this, we can do this." And he's really been, unfailing in his support for this project and for me. And I thank you all. And the one thing I particularly want to mention is, and I should say the Vail Daily wrote a lovely article, Onstage Colorado interviewed me. So people have worked together to promote this kind of idea like Shakespeare in Vail, what? The one thing I want to mention specifically is when people have asked me, why is Shakespeare in Vail? What are you doing? And I said, I want to build community. Well, how do you build community through Shakespeare? That sounds daunting. It sounds a little crazy. But the truth is, if you take a moment and look around, really look around, we have younger people, we have people who are a little bit older, like myself, and this is community. We're already starting. You're the seeds of this, okay? So we don't have to look to some other answer. We are the answer. This is community. So thank you very, very much for showing up. And last but not least, I want to thank Clay Jenkinson and Paul's not here, is he? He left town. But we want to thank you for your performance last night. We all enjoyed it. It was great. And, Shakespeare is so diverse. There's so many ways to approach Shakespeare. And Clay showed us one way to make that connection. And we thank you from the bottom of our heart for that. So without further ado, and it's a team. We're all a team in here now. We're all part of this growing Shakespeare community. We've planted the seeds, and here we go. So let me introduce our panel. I'm so proud of these people. I know them, each of them, fairly well. Some of them for longer than others. But I'm going to start with Amanda Giguere, Dr. Giguere. I love to call her that. She doesn't like me to call her that, but I do love to call her Dr. Giguere. Amanda serves as the Colorado Shakespeare Festival's Director of Outreach and oversees CSF's nationally recognized Shakespeare and Violence Prevention Initiative. She holds a PhD in theater from the University of Colorado Boulder and regularly teaches in CU Boulder's Applied Shakespeare program. Her work has appeared in Theater Journal and Theater Topics. Dr. Giguere's books include the plays of Yasmina Reza, on the English and American Stage by McFarland, and a forthcoming book, we're so excited about this, called Shakespeare and Violence Prevention, a Practical Handbook for Educators, and that is coming out from the University Press of Colorado, and we're going to talk a little more about that later. On this end, the other bookend here, Peter Garino is Artistic Director and Managing Producer of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago, a position he has held for the past 14 years. He is a co-founder of that company celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. The project produces theatrical staged readings of Shakespeare and his contemporaries using professional actors and presents them in libraries in Chicago and its suburbs. It also produces abridged productions of Shakespeare's plays that tour schools and communities. Since 1995, he has produced, directed, or appeared in over 150 of the Shakespeare Project's productions. So welcome, Peter. Next, we're going to bounce back to Kevin Rich, who I've known quite a long time. He's been my mentor, my friend, and sat on my committee in grad school. So he's had a lot of influence on me. Kevin is currently an associate professor of theater and director of the Applied Shakespeare Graduate Certificate Program at the University of Colorado Boulder. I was part of that program. He has directing and acting experience, a vast array of that, and has credits for that at the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, the American Shakespeare Center, Nebraska Repertory Theater, Illinois Shakespeare Festival, and at CU Boulder. He is both an actor and a director and a playwright. So kudos to you. And last but not least, we have with us Michelle Schupe, and she is a professional actor, director, and dramaturg. She has been active with the Shakespeare Project of Chicago for many years, as well as theaters throughout the country, including Broadway in Chicago, the Goodman Theater, the Shakespeare Theater Milwaukee Repertory, and Alabama Shakespeare Festival, to name a few. Michelle has several Helen Hayes nominations and serves as the Associate Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago. So please, let's welcome our distinguished panel. Yay for us. Yay. So the format of this discussion is going to be such that we came here asking the question, why are we still talking about Shakespeare? I mean, that's a really valid question. Why are we still talking about Shakespeare? I'm going to pose some questions to all of you that you will answer, if you would please, individually. Take a few minutes, and there'll be a couple of those, and then I'm going to ask you each questions directed to your specialties, although you've all done many different things. They've all been actors, they've all been directors, they've all been teachers, but we're going to lean into things I consider to be your specialty areas. So let's get this rolling, and I want to ask you, who wants to go first? Of course. I knew that was going to happen. And because I love your story, I know this is called an origin story. Where did things come from? How did they get started? So, Dr. Giguere, when did you first encounter Shakespeare? Was it a positive or a negative experience? And then when did you decide to become more involved with Shakespeare?
Testing. Oh, it's working. I love this question. I love to talk about it. And I think it's important for all of us actually to think about that question for ourselves too. When did you first encounter Shakespeare? Was it positive or negative? So I was 10 years old and I was at a sleepover at my friend Molly's house, and she was in a summer camp doing a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I remember her telling me, I'm playing Puck. And the cool thing about Shakespeare, Amanda, is that you can rap it. And I was like, what? And she goes, I'll show you what I mean. If we shadows have offended, think but this. And we were rocking out at this sleepover. I got insanely jealous of my friend. And so I remember going to see her perform as Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I was just so envious. And so the next summer I signed up for this kids Shakespeare camp. I played Ariel in The Tempest, which Kevin is directing for Colorado Shakespeare Festival this summer. And I remember wearing a bodysuit, like a unitard kind of situation with seaweed stapled to it. And Molly was we were co-playing Ariel. And I was the mischievous younger Ariel, and she was the older, more mature Ariel. And I just remember I was a really shy kid. I was terrified of public speaking. I was not really confident. I grew up in a household of 3 kind of loud brothers, boisterous brothers, and I'm sort of like the quiet one. And I remember feeling like I can be big. I can take up space. These big, big words. I still remember my first line of the play was, "All hail, great master, grave sir, hail. I come to answer thy best pleasure." And in a way, I think that set the tone for my relationship with Shakespeare, which is that something clicked. I knew maybe in my bones I was going to be doing something with these magical, magical words for a long time. So I would say it was a very positive first encounter. And for me, encountering Shakespeare was sort of like living in this magical, imaginative space. And I think that has kind of stayed with me forever. And I still feel like this awe and this sense of curiosity about the plays. Like I never quite have gotten to the bottom of them and never will. And as far as when I decided to stick with it, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm in it now. I guess I have decided by this point. But, you know, I ended up working for this same kids Shakespeare company for many years, directing plays with them, moved to Hong Kong, was teaching Shakespeare in Hong Kong, and ended up moving to Colorado because I wanted to apply for grad school, applied to CU Boulder. That was the one school I applied to because I heard there was a Shakespeare Festival there. And the rest was history. This is 20-something years ago now, and I've been at the Colorado Shakespeare Festival for 20 years. You didn't ask for my life story, but there you go.
Go ahead. Let's just go down the line, Kevin. And I'm kind of waiting to see if there's somebody who says, "Ew, I didn't have a great experience." Okay, you're the one.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
go do it.
Well, it's funny because that word encounter, right? When did I really encounter? But I think, well, it's so funny because when you said this question was coming and I was thinking about my answer, I was going to start with high school, but actually I was in a grade school production. Yeah, you reminded me. There was a 6th grade production of Hamlet that was, I think, rewritten in like a short version, and I was in 3rd grade.
Wow.
They were looking for someone. They just needed someone to be the second murderer. So I like in the play within a play. Yeah. So actually that was my first, but I didn't say anything, so I wasn't really thinking about the language. So I didn't, because my initial thought was I was one of those students who had to read it in an English class, in a stuffy, hot classroom in St. Louis, where I grew up. Last period of the day, everybody was restless, and I had to read it. So I didn't get a great first impression of it. And I sort of want to talk about the double-edged sword of Shakespeare being the only compulsory reading, like the only playwright who was compulsory reading in schools. And yet, it's reading. It's like asking someone to read the lyrics of a song, but never playing the music for them. So my first impression was, I don't know. I hadn't started theater yet. I hadn't gotten up the nerve to audition for a play. That didn't happen until right at the end of high school. So yeah, I thought, this is, I was not engaged. And then I got into theater. In college, my first role was in a Shakespeare play was Verges in Much Ado About Nothing. And spending a little time having to learn the lines. And then I thought, this actually isn't as difficult to understand as I thought. And that's the difference between reading it and then actually having to, or hearing it from actors who understand the words. And I say this a lot. I love this example. If I were to write, if you were to read the sentence, "This room is capacious," and you don't know what capacious means, then then I would feel kind of dumb. But if I hear someone say, this room is capacious, I don't feel dumb, I feel smart. I think I know what capacious means because it was spoken by someone who understands what the word means and conveyed the meaning of the word in the delivery of it. So I'm a big believer in needing to hear Shakespeare and see Shakespeare performed to really understand it. So in college, I was like, this isn't as bad as I thought. And then after I graduated college, I saw a 6-person version of As You Like It performed by 6 actors on a basketball court in the Lower East Side of New York as part of the New York Fringe Festival. And it was just, the only set was the basketball hoop. There were coffee can lights around, and people were watching these 6 actors play all the parts, change hats right in front of our eyes. It was funny. They were talking directly to the audience and engaging us. Kids who came to play basketball and saw that the basketball court had been taken over by theater people sat down on their basketballs and watched the play. And I was like, okay, that, I think, was my first encounter with Shakespeare. That, I have come to understand, that is Shakespeare. Theatrical, new, vibrant, breaking the fourth wall, connecting with the audience. That's how the plays were written to be performed. And I have since learned that when those plays are performed in that way, they work just as well today as I think they did 450 years ago. So
What a great story. I love that story. And I want to pause for a second and ask you, how many of you had Shakespeare in high school? Like, raise your hands. Oh, I didn't. How many of you didn't interact until a college experience? Clay, once again, you're our solo flyer here. Oh, college for you too. And I'll put my educator hat on for a second. You know, we see a lot of Shakespeare books around, the collected works, whatever. Shakespeare would be shocked by that. The plays were not written ever to be, in his mind, published as a book. They were to be performed on the stage. And it's interesting to hear that your experience are connected to performance, not to all of mine, and I'm not going to share it now, but it had to do with reading Macbeth. But so few people understand Shakespeare was meant for performance and the magic of theater, and it's transformative. So with that said, Michelle.
All right. So my first experience with Shakespeare was my grandmother, who absolutely loved it. And I don't know if you've seen those little pocket size. It's not the Loeb Classic Library because that's not Shakespeare. But it was Shakespeare with the gold edges on it, the little tiny pages that would like break down in nothing, and the vellum, right? And I had all of those. So we would read together Hamlet, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and King Lear. So we would read those together. And so I think I got a love of the language from her. My mother was an English professor, so further helped me understand it. When I then hit college, I did so many productions of Twelfth Night, I can't even tell you. I've done Twelfth Night a million times. And then I did King Lear when I got out into the professional world. And then finally, I think when the transformative moment for me was when I was lucky enough to get to play Imogen in Cymbeline, because suddenly Shakespeare was jazz to me. Because the plays like Twelfth Night and King Lear and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, especially Romeo and Juliet, are that very consistent meter, that iambic pentameter. But by the time you get to the romances, he's breaking the whole thing apart. And it's such a pleasure to play as an actor, because suddenly you're going, oh, I'm hitting a pronoun. Fantastic. Or now you've got this huge line that isn't a pentameter. It isn't pentameter. So that was probably my transformative moment. And I loved Imogen. If you do not know Cymbeline, if you can see it. It's an amazing, amazing play. Peter?
Thank you. That was fascinating. Peter, you're up.
Well, first of all, I want to thank James and Jill and Vail Symposium for bringing us out here from Chicago. I was saying earlier that, we've been in business for over 30 years, almost 30 years now. We've given certainly over 1,000 performances. Tonight will be the first performance we've ever given outside the state of Illinois. So kudos to Colorado. Thank you for having us. So my first exposure was in September of 1969. I was a freshman in high school, Mrs. Jakowski's freshman English class, and we had our little Pelican copies of Hamlet. And Mrs. Jakowski, on a Friday afternoon, we started the play. She brought in what they called in those days a record player. And she put on a recording of Richard Burton's Broadway performance of Hamlet from 1964. And we sat and listened, right? We listened and we followed along. And I heard you tell your story last night, Clay. For me, it was kind of transformational to hear the English language sound like that, okay? I had never heard anything like that before. End of class period, I went up to Mrs. Jakowski. I said, you think I could borrow that record over the weekend? Went home and listened to the whole play, and I kind of understood what was going on, right? Fast forward 4 years later, that was it. As far as Shakespeare in high school, that was it. But it stayed with me. And I did acting in high school, decided I wanted to be an actor. I got a scholarship to go to Hofstra University in New York, which I didn't even know when I auditioned there had the oldest collegiate Shakespeare Festival in the United States. And my very first class there was with Professor James Van Wert, wonderful man, who had worked with Tyrone Guthrie in Minneapolis and across the country. And he was our teacher, and we all freshmen of us, we had to learn the prologue to Henry V, Oh, for a Muse of Fire, right? One of us after another got up and did the speech. And he had some comments for various people, some longer than others. I did mine, and I was petrified, scared, everything else. And he said to me, I expect great things from you. Well, that was it. I didn't even think of it as pressure. I was like, no one had ever said that to me in my life about anything. That you've got something inside you that is going to come out and possibly be great. And now I tell this story to people, I say, I don't think I've ever really achieved greatness in my life, but I've never stopped trying. And I've, done some things, I guess, better than others. But the key here, like Kevin said before, and Jill as well, is that my entry in was not through reading. It was through hearing and listening. And I remember that year, too, I was listening to all kinds of rock music. That's what I loved. There was a British band named Yes. And they had a keyboard player named Rick Wakeman. And Rick Wakeman came out with an album called Journey to the Center of the Earth. Bought this record, and it was narrated by an English actor named David Hemmings. And once again, I'm hearing a guy intone beautiful prose and using his voice in a way that, was just, invigorating and new and different. And that kind of then continued to take my work. Freshman year, I'll finish up real quickly. Professor Van Wert cast me in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I had a non-speaking role. I was a guest at Theseus' wedding. Okay. It was opening night. I'm walking to the Playhouse, and here comes a helicopter flying in and landing right in front of the Playhouse. Who's this? Well, it was somebody, an alumni, who was Francis Ford Coppola, who was in Brooklyn shooting The Godfather Part 2. And I got to meet him in the party on the stage after the show, and I thought, this isn't too bad. This is my first experience with Shakespeare. Probably want to continue doing this. So that's it.
Excellent. All right, thank you for that. I mean, we all come to Shakespeare in different ways. Some as first graders, third graders. How old were you, Amanda?
10. I was
10, fourth grade maybe. I came to it much later in life when my father was had a side avocation as a book dealer, and I grew up with a lot of books in our house. And I think he loved the books more than he really loved the contents. But, he traded in books and when he wasn't doing his real job. But I grew up with a lot of shoulds. Well, you should be familiar with this. You should be familiar with that. And I came across a very tattered copy of Macbeth. Remember Scholastic books? And we ordered them as little kids. I had a Scholastic book of Macbeth, and I picked it up and thought, I probably really should read this. And that was where I went down the rabbit hole and said, I love this. I love the story. I love the language. Well, be that as it may, we're all here now. And I want to move on because we are on limited time. And we'll cut to the chase. The topic of our speech today, or our discussion, is why are we still talking about Shakespeare? It seems sort of obvious, and yet it doesn't when you really think about the question. And there are people in the world of education and people who are looking at what's going on in culture and society, and they say, this is an old dead white guy. We don't need to be talking about this, thinking about this, teaching this. And we're going to get to a more specific question about that later. But I would like to rather quickly go through and get your take on why are we still talking about Shakespeare slightly over 430 years later. And let's go back the other direction. Peter, you want to take that?
Yes. How can we not talk about him? He's embedded in our culture. If you think about the progression of culture over the years, we have the Greeks, right? We have the Romans, and we have Shakespeare, and he was influenced by them, right? We've built a culture in this country, and his influence on other writers has been profound. The people who have been influenced by, what he wrote. So I don't know how we can disconnect him. He's that much a part of our legacy and our culture. He's in our language all the time without people even knowing it, all the coined phrases that we use all the time, And, I'm very interested today when even you hear the people, a news commentator or somebody describe something as, it's very Shakespearean. Well, if people don't know who he is, what are they going to think? What does that mean?
Okay, I think we're still talking about Shakespeare because he was a secular humanist. So it means that we are experiencing through his work love, rage, grief, sorrow, all of the things that we all experience. And I think putting it into a poetic form helps it to get it into our hearts, and it's something we're all experiencing collectively.
I love that. And to add to that, I think it's been my experience of Shakespeare that he's had this ability to sort of disappear into his plays, which is to say, was able to take the side of multiple perspectives. I had a teacher once say there are no villains in Shakespeare. And at first I thought, what do you mean? They do some pretty bad things in Shakespeare. There's some villainous behavior happening, but I think that's just it. Yes, there are characters who might do bad things, but Shakespeare gives every character the opportunity to argue why. Why? And so maybe that's why there are so many conspiracy theories about Shakespeare, because you don't really know where he stood. Some plays I read, you know exactly what point of view the playwright has, and that's absolutely fine. I think Shakespeare and, Shakespearean theater, one characteristic that I've always loved is that you've got multiple points of view in the same play. So the audience really becomes like, who am I rooting for? Because everyone's got a point. And I think that might be why, and we might have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work we've done in community-based settings, why so many people find their way into these plays, because so many different perspectives are represented in the plays.
These are really good answers. I don't know that I have anything smart to add to what these people have said, other than, along the lines of what Kevin just said, is this openness about the plays, that there is I don't know that ambiguity is the right word, but there's this sort of, we're telling all sides of a story, and there's not a thesis statement. about a play. There's not a clear sense of what is right and what is wrong. Instead, when we agree to enter the experience of going to a play, we are putting ourselves through a process, which is we're going to experience some things. And that openness, I think, makes the plays very transferable, where I can see myself in Hamlet. There's this openness kind of allows for that. Emma Smith, who wrote a great book called This is Shakespeare, talks about Shakespeare's gappiness, that there's sort of like enough gaps where each one of us in this room can put ourselves in the play and imagine being there. So I think that feels like a really healthy exercise in being human, sort of putting ourselves in stories, doing it together as a group, and then we leave the theater and we go back to our lives.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We've talked generally, and you always want to make sure you talk about the topic you said you were going to talk about. So we're talking about why are we still talking about Shakespeare? But I want to lean into each of your expertise. And again, these folks have done a lot of things. And I'm only leaning into topics with certain people because maybe currently this is what they're involved in. So I'll have specific questions for each of you now, and then we're going to circle back to more general questions. So Amanda, you're up again. Shakespeare's world was violent and unpredictable. His works reflect that. Even the comedies usually begin with the threat of harm to a main character. How do you work with that in your violence prevention programming? She runs a nationally recognized violence prevention program. I'm not done yet. Why did you decide to focus yourself? Why did you decide to focus on Shakespeare and violence prevention? Tell us kind of what that journey looked like. Why is this important now in 2025? And then lastly, I'm going to come back and ask you a follow-up.
Keep me on track for all those questions in case I miss
I
one.
will, because we are on the
Okay,
clock.
I'll do it quickly too. Let's see. In 2011, I was working at the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, and we were planning a tour to go around to schools. And at the time, we were hearing a lot about bullying in the news. And we started thinking, we're going to be touring 12th Night to local schools, which is a play probably many of you have read with Jill's class, where Malvolio is a character who is pranked. They write him an anonymous letter that makes it sound like it's from his boss, and they trick him into behaving really foolishly, wearing yellow stockings. And we started thinking, is there a way to connect what happens to Malvolio to contemporary issues of bullying? And a colleague at the CU Boulder campus put me in touch with the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence. And I went into that meeting thinking, they're going to recommend an article for me to read about what is bullying. And at that meeting, I explained what the play was about, and they said, we want to partner with you. Our goal is to get research, which we have about how to prevent bullying, into the hands of the people who need it the most. And it seems like a live performance could be a really interesting way to do that. So we thought, okay, sure. And now 14 years later, we've turned that into a Shakespearean violence prevention program, which essentially looks at an abridged Shakespeare play that depicts many moments of harm or mistreatment, and it's not always overt acts of violence. It's kind of upstream behaviors, like we're going to target Malvolio and prank him, because those kind of behaviors build a foundation that eventually leads to violence. And so really what we found in years of running this program is that Shakespeare gives us a really good opportunity to, again, not teach any lessons, but to show young people and people of all ages what human behavior sometimes looks like, which is sometimes there's love and joy and connection, and sometimes there's not. Sometimes there is targeted isolation, sometimes there's harassment, sometimes there's direct violence, sometimes there's indirect violence, sometimes it's verbal violence. But all of these things help us see better about how people behave. Okay, one part of your question was why, so really Shakespeare's plays become, yes, he was living in a violent world. We kind of are too. Our violence doesn't look like, we're not putting the heads of traitors on the city gates, but it shows up differently. And really, I think in sharing these performances with young people, it can become a way to just get curious about human behavior. Why does Macbeth want to murder the king? That's a pretty extreme example. That's not really an upstream example. But, we're touring a production of Much Ado About Nothing right now that Kevin directed for us. And we're taking it into middle and high schools. And that play is so much about rumors and gossip and misinformation. And how can a rumor be a type of violence? How does that set us up to see someone as less human? And I think that is what a great deal of it comes down to is engaging with Shakespeare is engaging with what it means to be human. And that is foundational to preventing violence. When we see every single person around us as a full human with full complexity, not a villain. I didn't intentionally point to you when I said villain, but I'm just referring back to what you said. That then we are less likely to want to harm people. We're more likely to see ourselves as connected to them.
I want to ask you a quick follow-up question. What has been the outcome of this? What do the kids say about this after they've been through your program?
Yeah, I think a big takeaway is there's a level of surprise that Shakespeare can be funny. I think we have a misconception in our world that adults tend to be really afraid of Shakespeare. It's something really fancy and high up on a dusty shelf that we can't really touch and play with. I think, and this program has reached about 140,000 students since we started back in 2011. And yeah, the overall takeaway is it was fun. It was funny. And I think violence prevention can also be fun. We can get creative with these solutions. The key that we sort of use in these post-show conversations with kids is we get the chance now to practice being an upstander in many of these situations where we saw the characters choose an outcome that led to more harm. What can you do in this situation? So there's a level of inventiveness and creativity where you get to kind of play.
That's great. Thank you. We're really trying to show you Shakespeare in use now, and as she said, not up on a dusty shelf. And I have one student back there, Wendy, who I know took her college textbook off the shelf and said it sat here gathering dust, and now she's using it and reading it, and we're talking about it. But when I hear dusty shelf, I always think of you mentioning that. So, and what we're talking about here is applied Shakespeare, and probably most of you, I'm guessing, haven't heard that term, but applied Shakespeare is not just going to the theater and seeing a performance. It's actually doing something with Shakespeare. And I have my mentor, my guide, Kevin Rich. He directs the Applied Shakespeare Graduate Program at CU. I went through that program, and then I went on to grad school. Thank you, Kevin. I showed up. That was good. So your question is, what is applied Shakespeare? How did you become involved in that aspect? Because he's done everything. He's acted, he's directed, he's written plays. How did you become involved in that? And tell us about some of the different applications that we know so well, you and I know really well, and maybe you would share that with these folks who I think will be very surprised by what we're doing with Shakespeare in an applied sense.
Great. Well, I think we just heard an excellent example of applied Shakespeare in the Shakespearean violence prevention program. It's often like Shakespeare and something, it's, intersecting. But so how I came to it, so before I joined the faculty at CU in 2016, which is almost 10 years ago now. Can you believe it? It's crazy. I was artistic director of the Illinois Shakespeare Festival, which is how I met these two, actually. Small world, it's a very small world of Shakespeare nerds. And running the MFA acting program, the graduate acting program at ISU. And I was hired to sort of find ways to more deeply integrate the graduate acting program into the activities of the Shakespeare Festival, which, like many, was a summer festival. So through the 8 graduate actors that we had, we were able to start to investigate have a year-long presence in the community, because they became the touring company for the Shakespeare Festival, and they took plays and workshops and abridgments into schools, prisons, retirement communities, other community centers. And it was that work that I started. I had gone into schools before. I had never taken Shakespeare into prisons. And that was an absolutely life-changing experience for me.
That again, he took Shakespeare into prisons. Yes, you heard correctly. Prisons.
That opened up a window into, then I was like, I need to learn more about this. And I discovered that there are many arts practitioners doing work in prisons. So many that there's in fact a Shakespearean Prisons network that they have conferences and share best practices. There's a wonderful documentary called Shakespeare Behind Bars that I highly recommend, and a new movie that just came out, Sing Sing, that I haven't seen yet, but intend to soon. So it's really amazing work that's happening. Well, maybe I'll just talk about that for a second, because it kind of connects to the last round, how we talked about how there are no villains in Shakespeare. Shakespeare was arguably pushing back against the plays that he grew up watching. Many of them came out of the church, where there was a right and a wrong. There were characters who were virtue and vice personified. Shakespeare seemed to be interested in, well, humanity is maybe more complex than that, and what happens if a character actually changes over the course of the play? In many Shakespeare plays, the person who starts the play is not the person who ends the play. There's this possibility of transformation. And what I was learning going into prisons was inmates were saying, these plays are about transformation. I am trying to forgive myself for one thing I did, for a moment in time. Can I forgive myself, much less can I seek forgiveness from others? So I think there's something in the DNA of those plays about them being about transformation. I had an inmate once say, I think Shakespeare must have done time, because nobody could write the prison scene in Richard II without having been in a cell. I've had veterans say to me, Shakespeare must have been in combat, because nobody could write the war plays, the history plays, with a perspective without having done it. And of course, I mentioned there are conspiracy theories where they say, well, Shakespeare couldn't have even been Shakespeare, because you can't write about monarchs without having been. So it must have been a good friend of Queen Elizabeth's using the pseudonym, because nobody can have that level of empathy without having actually done it themselves. Or maybe he did, maybe he was just able to, and that's what makes these plays so profound in these, we heard a great example of Shakespeare in schools, and there's also really exciting work happening with adult populations, not just in prisons. Another area is Shakespeare with veterans, where those programs are popping up in trauma-informed settings where I've heard veterans say, Shakespeare gives me the language I don't have to process what I went through. And it opens up conversations that I just don't have the language for, and Shakespeare gave it to me. So there is really amazing work happening, and so to get back to your question around this applied Shakespeare program, I couldn't stop talking about this community-based work that we were doing as a touring company. Someone sent me a job description for this position that opened up at CU, where they were looking for someone whose work and whose research and creative work was aligned with this emerging field of applied Shakespeare. And I heard that phrase and was like, I gotta apply for the job. And so since joining the faculty in 2016, I've gotten to create classes for our theater department called Shakespearean Community that surveys the work of applied Shakespeare practitioners, Shakespeare in modern adaptation, because another way to think about how do we applying Shakespeare to new work. So many interesting adaptations of Shakespeare in popular culture are happening, and really that's what Shakespeare was doing. Shakespeare didn't write original plot lines. Shakespeare was adapting his historical narratives for his contemporary audience. So I've gotten pushback from people who say, you can't do that to Shakespeare, but Shakespeare did that to Plautus, So this idea of adaptation, this idea of applying Shakespeare in community has been a focus since I've gotten to see you. And this graduate certificate program that Jill was a star pupil of is a 9-credit graduate certificate that it's 2 of the classes are online and then there's an on-campus component that brings together teachers, scholars, enthusiasts, theater artists who are interested in this phrase, applied Shakespeare. How does Shakespeare apply to our lives? And it's always a really rich cohort that comes together because everyone's coming at Shakespeare from a different perspective. It's an interdisciplinary collaboration between 3 programs on campus, English, Theater, and Dance, and Colorado Shakespeare Festival. So the first class is with English, the second is the Shakespearean community class I mentioned, and the third is non-campus intensive with Colorado Shakespeare Festival, where everybody comes together after Zooming in the first 2 classes and sees the shows at the festival. Then they have to create a capstone project. That's the final thing to get the certificate is to create some sort of a capstone that allows them to sort of define applied Shakespeare on their terms. So teachers will often create lesson plans, curriculum revisions, direct a play with their students. Theater artists might create a workshop with a specific population, like I mentioned, or a solo performance, or write a new play. I've had scholars write amazing research papers. I've had someone create a Shakespeare for Fun class in Vail, Colorado. So it's amazing. There's this little just army of good hearts coming out of this, 5 to 10 students a year who are then taking this amazing work into their communities in meaningful ways. And it's really delightful to see.
Thank you. I hope that clarifies the idea of applied Shakespeare. I had no idea when I went in the program. I really just was trying to learn more about Shakespeare, continue my education. And actually, my brilliant daughter said there's this program at CU. She was very connected there. And she said, you should go check that out. And I did, and sort of the rest is history now. But what I want you to realize is you are part of applied Shakespeare now, because my focus was, how do I bring Shakespeare into the community? How do I build community through Shakespeare? So that is, in fact, applied Shakespeare, right? So moving right along, Michelle, I have a question for you. We're going to switch gears. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. You're going to bring it home for us. You are an accomplished actor and director and dramaturg. Shakespeare's world did not allow women to be on the stage. Males played all the female parts. Tell us about women in theater in 2025. You are playing Richard II. She has been cast as Richard II. This is brilliant. It's a beautiful, beautiful play. And she's been cast for the Shakespeare Project of Chicago, working with Peter. Tell us about that. And what is your approach to the performance of what has been considered a male role?
Okay. All right. First of all, let me talk about actors in Shakespeare. Historically, obviously, all the roles were played by men. What a remarkable turning point we are at where women can now play those roles. I think you've seen the Redgraves do them. You've seen all sorts of people do all sorts of roles. And what actress worth her salt would not want to play Richard III? I mean, the thing that's interesting about the male roles versus the female roles is that they are written differently. The way that women speak and the way that men speak are 2 very different sort of creations. So what's fascinating about it as female identifying actors, we have learned the Portias, the Desdemonas, the Margarets, all of those roles. And so those are super easy for us because we understand what the timbre and the rhythm of that is. When you then approach a role like Richard II, suddenly you're in rhetoric. You're in a whole bunch of different approaches. Let's call the army. Now, there is a crossover role here, which is Margaret of Anjou, because she also speaks an awful lot like a man, because she's talking to armies, whole armies. So I think it's a remarkable opportunity that no female identifying actor is going to turn down. Let me speak quickly about, I just finished a production of Mackers in Washington, D.C. that I cast all female identifying actors. So Mackers himself was being played by a female identifying actress. And what's interesting about that is, even if that actor is playing a character that identifies as male, once you take those words and put them in an actress's mouth, suddenly the audience is hearing it in a completely different way. There was the last part of that question.
Really, just what is your approach going to be?
Yeah, my approach
taking on this role?
to any role that I'm offered is just to figure out what makes that character tick. So I believe we will be using he, him pronouns. So I will be playing Richard II as male, even though I self-identify she, her, hers.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. All right, you're up, my friend. Peter, you have been producing Shakespeare in your community for many years. Why? And what motivates you to do community theater? I mean, this is hard. It took work to get you folks out here. I mean, I was on the phone, I was emailing, I was calling in all kinds of, friends saying, come on, show up for me. So what got you motivated to do community theater? What are the rewards and challenges? And I know you could write volumes on this. And last but not least, how do you choose what you're going to put up?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Well, I just found out we've been doing applied Shakespeare for 30 years, and it is
You have.
supplied in the community. So our origin story at the Shakespeare Project is really interesting. In 1995, a small group of equity actors got together, and we went to auditions, and we discovered we really love Shakespeare. So, let's just get together one night. Let's read a play together. So we got a room in a place called Burger Park in Chicago that was run by the Chicago Park District, okay? And this Burger Park was a kind of arts cultural center. People were doing painting and fine art and creating music, and we're sitting in a room reading A Midsummer Night's Dream. We had done this for a few weeks, and then I think it was during one of our subsequent readings when we took our break and we went outside, and there were people standing outside the door. And they said, do you think we just might be able to come in and listen to what you're doing? That was our beginning in community focus, right? We perform in public libraries. Those are our venues, all right? And what we do is very analogous as to what happened in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare had an itinerant theater company that would go to the hinterlands. And where would they set up? They'd set up in the town square. Somebody would put up a stage, the people would gather, the performance would be free, and they would do the show and move on to the next community. That's exactly what we do with professional actors. And we've been doing it in our communities for upwards of most of our libraries, 15 years and up. We do a 4-show season that begins in September and runs through June. So we have become, in these communities, part of the cultural fabric of the community itself. We're not like an external arts organization that parachutes in the summertime and does something and goes away. This is what we do, all right? It's a business model like no other, okay? We get some funding from a library, but we're primarily dependent upon individual donors who believe in the idea of making Shakespeare accessible to all. That's really what we do, okay? How do we choose our season? Well, we have 36 plays in the canon to go through, And we've gone through the entire canon 3 times, right? Now we're about starting on the 4th. When I became artistic director in 2010, I decided to start focusing and throwing in one of his contemporaries each year. So each year we do 3 Shakespeare, and then we do one of his contemporaries. Middleton, Heywood, Johnson, Kidd, you name it. There were really good writers besides Shakespeare at this time, all right? But people love hearing the works of other writers and, you know, experiencing what that was like as well. So that's basically, hopefully answers your question.
It does. That was great. Thank you so much. We are running close to time, and I had a whole litany of questions. I mean, this could go on for many hours, and it will be certainly a reason to do this all again. But I have one more question I want to, for sure, get to, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. This is not directed at any specific person, and you haven't heard this yet, so we'll see how you do riffing on this. Because the reason we came here was why are we still talking about Shakespeare? But it begs the question, why should we still be talking about Shakespeare, and what is that going to look like? So here's my question. Tell us where you see Shakespeare production and education going in the future, and what projects do you possibly have going forward? But we know where we've come from. Where do you think we're going, and where do we need to be going? And there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to hear your opinions, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A, so be thinking of your questions.
I'll start. Do you want to go?
No surprise there.
Another great teacher said once, politics and religion offer answers, and it's the answers that divide us. Great theater, like Shakespeare, asks questions, and it's the questions that unite us. And what I think I love most about these plays in these settings that we've been talking about, that they're opening up dialogue across difference, asking questions that we're all asking, and bringing us together in a way that I think is really important. And I hope that continues to happen.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to follow up.
It was a teacher that said it's amazing.
I'm going to answer the question about where I see Shakespeare education going, because as Jill mentioned, and mine's going to be a very specific answer, and my hope, after years of running the Shakespearean violence prevention program in Colorado schools and our little van traveling wherever the little van can go, about 8 years ago I decided we need to get this work into more people's hands. And it cannot be just the troupe at the Colorado Shakespeare Festival doing the work of violence prevention through Shakespeare. Because think of how many teachers in this world teach Shakespeare already. And I firmly believe that when you teach Shakespeare, you are teaching violence prevention, because you're encouraging people to think with empathy and to think about, what is that person thinking and feeling? That is foundational to violence prevention. And so when my book comes out, it's a handbook for educators to use Shakespeare's plays in order to teach a violence prevention lens. But my real goal is to essentially train all people to become upstanders. And there's a lot of research in the world of violence prevention around the power of an upstander. For example, there was a study done in 2002 about playground bullies. And when one person became an upstander, which could just mean saying, that's not cool what you're doing, that's not cool, that's upstander behavior, 57% of the time when that happens, the bullying or mistreatment stops in 10 seconds or less. So there's a lot of power that we as witnesses to mistreatment or violence, we hold. And so my hope is that through programs like a Shakespearean violence prevention program or other similar programs, we can shift our culture from a culture of bystanders to a culture of upstanders, where we practice these skills just like we practice tying our shoes or writing in cursive, although we don't really do that anymore. Or we practice CPR. You have to practice to get better at these skills. And so my hope is that we can become a culture of upstanders where when we see mistreatment and harm, we of course take action because we recognize this is a fellow human who needs some help right now.
Thank you so much for that.
I'll just, a real quick anecdote on the future perhaps and community. We've just come out of an awful time with COVID. We were out of production for over a year and a half, and last year we resumed production. And when we gave our first performance in one of our local libraries, we always have post-show discussion dialogue, right? And it was amazing the number of people who just said to us at the end, "Thank you for bringing us together again." You know, people miss this connection, the group experience, which is what theater is about, especially against the obstacles that we face with streaming and isolation in someone's bedroom just watching something all the time. People came out again and they were so grateful that we were there for them. So that's really about community, and it's almost like, I thought, you know, just beyond they saw the comedy of errors, they had some entertainment. This was more important, that they were there looking at each other, sharing dialogue together at the end.
Great, thank you. And that it does bring up something I wanted to mention when we started this, that hopefully if you're, you know, grabbing a snack over there or a cup of coffee, that you will perhaps bump elbows with someone that you don't know yet. And a good conversation starter is, what brought you here today? Why did you decide to come to this? And whether you're at our performance this evening, again later this morning, it's a way to break the ice and just say, hey, I don't know you, I don't think we've met, but how did you happen to come today? And build community from fairly simple questions.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that I think the sky is the limit in terms of what we do moving forward. I think you can already see it happening. We were talking about a movie this morning, which is, help me with the title, Hamlet.
Grand Theft
Hamlet, okay. So people are already rethinking it and moving it forward. So whether you are pro-adaptation or anti-adaptation, I think what is happening as these things get adapted and that ball is being pushed down the field is that we're now talking about what is our current experience and how does Shakespeare relate to that? And what's so beautiful about that is the language holds.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Well, we're just about out of time for this session. Maybe there'll be a session in another year, we hope. But Megan, are you going to conduct a Q&A for us?
And then, but please first join me in giving these panelists and Jill a round of applause. And again, if for more in the meantime, this evening, Shakespeare for my father will be this evening at Vail Mountain School at 6 p.m. More details are at vailsymposium.org. And there are still some tickets available. So we encourage you to join us this evening. I will come to you with the microphone if there are a few questions. I'll start over here.
And you can ask any of us what you want to know.
I just wanted to know if any of you have an opinion about drunk Shakespeare.
Yeah, I definitely have an opinion about it.
It's happening in Chicago right now.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so do we have an opinion about drunk Shakespeare? For those of you that don't know, drunk Shakespeare is where a bunch of actors get together and one actor drinks like 4 shots of whiskey
In a row.
in a row and gets inebriated, and then they do whatever play they're doing. I have strong feelings about it because I am a member of Actors Equity Association, the union which fought to get this show brought into the union. And to me, it is very, very insensitive to the acting community, professional acting community, many of whom struggle with alcohol, okay? And basically to make a performer in their union, you know, consume alcohol to the extent that they become inebriated, how many times a week? I know they rotate it, I think. But I just think it's really dangerous because, you know, you fill in the blank. You could say, you know, drunk Hemingway. You could do the same thing. we have it at Wrigley Field. People get drunk and watch the Chicago Cubs play baseball, and it's just about that thing, and it's got very little to do with what's happening on the field, and ultimately they could care less about the play. So I'm very much not in favor of that happening, but it's happened. So.
All right.
Great question. Thank you.
Another question?
This goes back to the explanations on here. Okay, thank you. I'm an amateur. I question about the applied Shakespeare. You've given some answers that are sort of broadly demographically. Is applied Shakespeare ever used with specific ethnic groups to bridge a cultural gap? How Americans perceive Shakespeare has got to be different than how people from Bogota do, a little bit. And the language, of course, is no longer English. It's going to have to be translated. How is that handled, or is it part of applied Shakespeare at this time?
That's a great question. First I'll say that term is kind of still emerging, and people are still going, oh, that's a term that can be applied to the work I'm doing. I am not immediately aware of a project. I want to think more about it, and maybe, because I'm trying to think about, there's certainly, so I was just on sabbatical, and I just spent part of my sabbatical in Japan studying Japanese adaptations of Shakespeare, and I was learning a lot about, it really became focused on translation and this idea of translation. So part of my brain is thinking of a bunch of different examples of translations of Shakespeare and what happens when you're changing the language, and that's a whole conversation. But the notion of, there are definitely specific, there are theater companies that do work with, the Star was just,
Shakespeare's Globe did an international Hamlet tour. They were taking Hamlet to different countries and I think adapting it for each country.
In 2012, they held because London was hosting the Olympics, so the Globe hosted sort of a globe to globe where they did the whole canon. Every play was from a different country in a different language. So I think of that, and I wonder if there were wonderful conversations that came out of that.
There's also, just theater companies all over the world. I just got back from the Shakespeare Theater Association conference, which is essentially Shakespeare companies all over the world. And my colleagues at a company called Shakespearean Paradise, which is in the Bahamas, it's based in Nassau, they're producing the plays always with an eye toward their audience too. And so I think, I don't know if I would call that applied Shakespeare, but maybe every act of staging a Shakespeare play is
some
applied.
way of applying it. Yeah, great question.
I think we could probably take one more.
I was in high school between 1962 and 1966, probably before your time, but there was some centennial going on about Shakespeare. So all the schools were very involved in teaching Shakespeare. The one play I remember, as nobody has mentioned, is The Merchant of Venice. And I think Clay said, why is Shakespeare still relevant today? Well, that was about anti-Semitism. Neither a borrower or a lender be, and Shylock. And it's, I was in Catholic schools. I didn't even know a Jewish person, so I didn't know anything about this. But later on, I started kind of investigating, and they couldn't own property, so that's why they became bankers, and that's where they are today. And because they all have so much money, that's why there's still a lot of anti-Semitism. So I thought that was interesting that he was talking about this back then, and it's a problem that we still have today.
I could speak very briefly to that. I don't know if I have any answers, but again, just more kind of rumination on this. Merchant is a title that we toured with our violence prevention program a couple of years ago. And unfortunately, the timing was that we were touring this show just as Kanye was spouting off all the, what does he call now? Yay. Yes. So there was a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric that really reared its head. And I think it's a fascinating play to think about bias, and not just in the anti-Semitism, but in the way that Portia judges each person. And there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of misogyny, there's a lot of, just a lot of fear of the other in that play. And boy, is that an interesting play to stage and then unpack. And I think that's where I think of Shakespeare in an educational setting, where we can use it as a tool to look at ourselves in the mirror and think, well, this play was written in the late 1500s. What feels resonant today about this? And so it's an opportunity to look at our own culture and really kind of dig into some very uncomfortable questions. And again, it's hard work. It was a hard show to tour, because I think there's also the fear of, is the audience going to get that this is a way of looking at anti-Semitism without reinforcing anti-Semitism or racism or misogyny?
I think, the title refers to Antonio, who is the Catholic, who does these terrible things to Shylock. Anti-Semitism was rampant in the Elizabethan period. Rodrigo Lopez, who was Queen Elizabeth's personal physician, was Portuguese, and he was a Jew. And he was accused, suspected of plotting to assassinate her, and was executed publicly. It's very possible Shakespeare might even have seen the execution. So he was writing very much about events and violence and things that he was seeing firsthand.
Yeah, I want to jump on that too. In my class, the last semester I taught, we did Merchant of Venice, and we take it one act a week. So we really dive in. We watch performance, we watch film, we watch stage. And that play is about, in fact, not only anti-Semitism, but mercy versus justice, parent-child relationships. There's a lot going on in this play. But the point I want to make is that people often ask, or it comes up in class, well, Shakespeare must have thought this or had this opinion. As Kevin said earlier, that's really not true. The plays don't express specific opinions. The characters may have an opinion, but they are not necessarily Shakespeare's opinion. And I try to tell people what Shakespeare does for us in 2025 and all the years in between. He breaks open the questions. The play The Merchant of Venice asks us questions. How does mercy stand up against justice? How do parents and children interact? How are we treating the other? So Shakespeare asks us a lot of questions and doesn't really provide us a lot of straight up opinion. Okay? So with that, I think we'll wrap this up for today.
Yes, thank you again all so much.